Night settled gently over Baker Street, not with weight or urgency, but like a familiar blanket drawn slowly across the shoulders of the city. The lamps along the street glowed with a softened amber light, each one surrounded by a pale halo as fog drifted lazily through the air. It was the kind of fog that muted sound, that smoothed sharp edges, that turned hurried footsteps into distant echoes, and thoughts into slow-moving shapes. Inside number 2001B, the world was quieter still. The sitting room rested in a state of calm order. Books stood in patient rows, their spines dark and unassuming. Papers were neatly stacked, not abandoned in haste, but placed with intention, as though their owner knew he would return to them in time. The fire in the grate had settled into a steady, low murmur, glowing rather than blazing, offering warmth without demand. Sherlock Holmes sat in his chair by the window, his long frame relaxed, his hands loosely folded. He was not reading. He was not writing. His gaze rested beyond the glass, where the fog curled and shifted, reshaping the street again and again into something half imagined. To the casual observer, he might have seemed idle. But stillness, for Holmes, was never empty. The city breathed outside, carriages passing slowly, a distant call from somewhere far down the street, the soft rhythm of London at rest. Holmes listened without effort. Each sound arrived, lingered, and drifted away, leaving no disturbance behind. This was not a night for pursuit, not a night for deduction, not even a night for memory. It was a night for awareness. The violin lay nearby, untouched. Its polished surface caught the firelight, reflecting it in warm curves. Holmes had played earlier, long, wandering phrases that had filled the room without asking to be remembered. Now, the silence that followed felt complete, rather than lacking, as though the music had simply settled into the walls. Across the room, Dr. Watson sat with a book open in his lap. Though he had not turned the page in some time, his eyes moved occasionally, not across the text, but toward his friend by the window. There was something different in Holmes's posture tonight, nothing dramatic, nothing that could be easily named, just a sense of pause, as if a long-running mechanism had slowed of its own accord. Watson broke the silence softly. "The fog is particularly thick tonight." Holmes nodded, without turning his head. "Yes," he said, "it suits the hour." His voice was calm, unhurried, free of the sharpness that often accompanied his words. There was no tension in it now, no edge. Watson waited, sensing no need to hurry the conversation. Over years of shared rooms and longer silences, he had learned when speech was welcome and when it was not. Holmes shifted slightly, the movement slow and deliberate. "There are moments," he said at last, "when even the most intricate patterns become quiet." Watson closed his book, resting it on the arm of his chair. "And what brings on in such moments?" Holmes allowed a faint smile, one that held no triumph. "Clarity," he replied, "not the kind that reveals answers, but the kind that accepts their presence." Outside, a carriage passed, its wheels muffled by the fog. The sound faded almost as soon as it appeared. Holmes rose and crossed the room, standing before the mantel. He adjusted nothing. He simply stood there, watching the fire settle into glowing embers. "There are forces in the world," he continued, "that do not announce themselves loudly. They move quietly, patiently. They do not rush, they wait." Watson felt the familiar tightening of concern, though Holmes's tone offered no alarm. "You speak as though you expect something," Watson said. "I do," Holmes answered. "But expectation need not bring unrest." He turned then, meeting Watson's gaze. His eyes were clear, steady, and perhaps most unusually at ease. "Some paths," Holmes said, are followed for a long time before one notices where they truly lead. The fire gave a gentle crackle, sending a brief shower of sparks upward before settling again. Watson nodded, though he did not fully understand. With Holmes, understanding often arrived later, unfolding in its own time. The clock on the mantel marked the passing minutes with soft certainty. Each tick felt measured, unhurried, unconcerned with what came before or after. Holmes returned to his chair, settling once more by the window. The fog outside thickened, and then thinned, like a slow tide moving through the street. For now, Holmes said quietly, it is enough to observe, to be still, to let the night pass as it will. Watson leaned back, allowing his breath to slow, matching the rhythm of the room. The warmth of the fire, the muted sounds of the city, and the steady presence of his companion combined into a sense of rounded calm. There would be journeys ahead. There would be distances to cross. But none of that belonged to this moment. This moment belonged to the fog, to the fire, to the quiet assurance that not everything needed to be solved tonight. And so Baker Street rested, suspended between thought and sleep, as the city beyond its windows drifted deeper into the arms of the night. Morning arrived without announcement. There was no sharp edge to it, no sudden burst of light. Instead, it filtered gently through the fog that still lingered over Baker Street, turning the world outside the windows into a pale wash of silver and gray. The gas lamps had dimmed, their glow now unnecessary, their watch over the night complete. Inside the rooms at 201B, the air remained warm and settled. The fire had been carefully tended and now rested in a steady state, neither roaring nor fading. The room seemed to hold its breath, as though aware that the day would move more slowly here than elsewhere. Sherlock Holmes was awake. He sat at the small table near the window, a cup of tea resting untouched beside him. A single sheet of paper lay before him, blank, its surface unmarked by ink or intention. His fingers rested lightly at its edge, not poised right, merely acknowledging its presence. There was no urgency in him this morning, no rush of thoughts demanding attention. Instead, his mind moved with quiet precision, reviewing not details, but impressions. The shape of recent days, the tone of certain encounters, the weight of patterns too complete to ignore. Across the room, Watson stirred and woke, the familiar surroundings easing him into consciousness. He sat up slowly, listening first, as he often did. The city offered its subdued morning sounds, distant hooves, a cart rolling somewhere far off, the murmur of voices softened by fog. Holmes did not turn. "You are awake early," Watson said gently. Holmes nodded once. "Sleep was unnecessary," he replied. "Rest was sufficient." Watson rose and moved about the room, pouring tea for himself. He noticed the untouched cup beside Holmes. "You did not drink yours in time," Holmes said. Watson sat opposite him, watching as his friend gazed through the window. There was something restrained in Holmes's stillness, as though he were holding a thought carefully, examining it from all sides, without allowing it to settle too firmly. "You seem thoughtful," Watson offered. Holmes's expression did not change. "Thoughtful implies uncertainty," he said. "This is closer to recognition." Watson waited. "There are few minds," Holmes continued, "capable of constructing complexity without chaos. Fewer still do so without leaving traces. Rarest of all are those who understand patience." Watson frowned slightly. "You speak of an adversary." Holmes inclined his head, the smallest acknowledgement. "Not an adversary in the common sense," he said. "Not one driven by impulse or pride. This is something colder, more deliberate." The word something lingered in the air, undefined. Watson sipped his tea, grounding himself in the warmth. "And does this recognition trouble you?" Holmes paused before answering. "No," he said at last, "but it clarifies." He finally reached for his cup, lifting it slowly. The steam rose and disappeared almost at once, merging with the pale light at the window. "There comes a point," Holmes said, "when pursuit gives way to alignment, when opposing forces move along paths that are no longer avoidable." Watson studied him carefully. "You speak as though this has already been decided." "In a sense," Holmes replied. "Yes." The clock marked the hour. Outside, the fog thinned slightly, revealing outlines of buildings before drawing them back again. Watson felt the familiar mixture of trust and concern. Holmes had often faced danger with a calm that bordered on indifference, but this was different. There was no challenge in him now, no spark of anticipation, only a quiet acceptance. "Will you tell me what you see?" Watson asked. Holmes looked at him then, truly looked, and his expression softened. "In time," he said. "For now it is enough that you understand this. Some contests are not meant to be won in the usual sense. They are meant to be concluded." Watson nodded slowly. Holmes stood and crossed the room, retrieving his violin. He did not play immediately. He adjusted the strings with care, listening to their response, ensuring balance rather than brilliance. When he finally drew the bow across them, the sound that emerged was low and unhurried. The melody wandered gently, without tension or climax, moving as the fog moved, shifting, reshaping, never settling. The music filled the room, smoothing its edges, easing Watson's thoughts into quiet alignment with the sound. As Holmes played, his gaze returned to the window. The street beyond seemed distant now, almost unreal. His attention was elsewhere, not ahead, not behind, but within the space of calm awareness. There was no fear in him, no urgency, only the understanding that certain paths, once revealed, were best followed with clarity rather than resistance. The final notes faded, dissolving into silence. Holmes lowered the violin and rested it beside him. "The day will unfold as it must," he said softly. "We will meet it calmly." Watson felt the room settle once more into stillness. The fire murmured, the city breathed, and somewhere beyond the fog, unseen but certain, the quiet machinery of inevitability continued its steady motion. For now Baker Street remained a place of pause, a moment suspended between recognition and action, wrapped gently in the slow, untroubled rhythm of morning. The day progressed quietly, as though London itself had agreed not to intrude. Fog continued to soften the streets, thinning only enough to allow movement without clarity. Sounds arrived gently and departed just as easily, leaving no sharp impressions behind. Within the sitting room at 221B, the atmosphere remained unchanged. Time seemed less inclined to move forward here. It circled instead, repeating familiar comforts, the warmth of the fire, the faint scent of tea, the reassuring weight of silence. Sherlock Holmes sat once more at the table, not engaged in work but in consideration. The blank paper from earlier remained, untouched and unmarked, as though its purpose lay not in what would be written upon it, but in what it represented, possibility without insistence. Watson observed him quietly. Over the years, he had learned to recognize the difference between Holmes in contemplation and Holmes in calculation. This was neither problem-solving nor anticipation. It was something deeper, slower, and far more settled. "Their minds," Holmes said at last, without lifting his eyes, "that never seek attention. They prefer to exist as structure rather than spectacle." Watson listened. "They shape events indirectly," Holmes continued, "leaving others to believe themselves responsible. They require no acknowledgement, only outcome. Watson shifted slightly in his chair. You speak as though you have known such a mind for some time. Holmes allowed a faint exhale, almost a sigh, though not born of weariness. Awareness precedes familiarity, he said. I have been aware for years. The fire settled, a quiet collapse of embers into deeper glow. Outside, a distant bell marked the hour, its sound dulled by distance and fog. There is comfort, Holmes went on, in confronting a force that is honest about its nature. Deception implies uncertainty, precision does not. Watson considered this. And this presence, he said, choosing his words carefully, is it near? Holmes did not answer immediately. Near and far are relative, he replied instead. What matters is alignment. He rose and crossed the room slowly, stopping before the shelves lined with books. His fingers traced their spines without selecting any one volume, as though acknowledging a long-standing relationship rather than seeking new insight. Imagine, Holmes said, a design so complete that it leaves no room for improvisation, each element placed with intent, each movement anticipated. Watson frowned slightly. That sounds restrictive. Only to those who resist structure, Holmes replied. To others, it is clarity. He returned to his chair, settling once more by the window. The fog outside had thickened again, obscuring the street until it resembled a blank canvas, indistinct and quiet. There are times, Holmes said softly, when one becomes aware of being observed, not by eyes, but by understanding. Watson felt a subtle chill, though Holmes's tone remained even. And does that disturb you? Watson asked. No, Holmes answered. It reassures me. Watson raised an eyebrow, but did not interrupt. To be understood fully, Holmes continued, is rare. To encounter an intellect capable of such understanding is rarer still. He paused, allowing the thought to settle. Opposition of that kind, Holmes said, is not chaos. It is symmetry. Watson leaned back, absorbing the words rather than questioning them. The room seemed to grow quieter still, as though even the fire had lowered its voice. Do you intend to confront this symmetry? Watson asked. Holmes smiled faintly, a gesture without pride or challenge. Confrontation implies aggression, he said. This will be closer to convergence. Outside, footsteps passed beneath the window, then faded. The city moved on, unaware of the currents beneath its surface. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, not in fatigue, but in acknowledgement. When he opened them again, his gaze was steady, calm, untroubled. There are paths, he said, that narrow naturally, not because one is forced, but because alternatives fall away. Watson felt the weight of those words without feeling alarmed by them. Holmes had spoken often of danger, of threat, of conflict. Never before had he spoken of inevitability with such peace. If the path narrows, Watson said, I will walk it with you. Holmes turned to him then, and for a moment something unspoken passed between them, gratitude, respect, and the quiet certainty of shared resolve. I know, Holmes said simply. The afternoon light shifted subtly, changing the color of the room from pale gray to soft gold. Dust motes drifted lazily in the air, unhurried and unconcerned. The presence Holmes had described did not announce itself. It did not arrive with sound or sign. It existed as it always had, patient, precise, unseen. And within the stillness of Baker Street, two men sat quietly, aware that the balance of forces had begun its final, gentle adjustment. For now, there was nothing to do, nothing to solve, nothing to escape, only the calm acceptance that some understandings arrive not as revelations, but as quiet acknowledgments, settling into place as naturally as night follows day. And so the room remained at rest, wrapped in fog and silence, as the unseen presence drew closer, not in haste, but in perfect, measured time. The afternoon eased into evening with little distinction between the two. Light faded gradually, as though London itself preferred not to mark the transition too clearly. The fog remained faithful to the street, thinning just enough to allow silhouettes to pass, then returning to soften them again into anonymity. Inside the rooms at 221B, the quiet persisted. Watson had taken to the armchair nearest the fire, not for warmth alone, but for the sense of steadiness it provided. The gentle glow of the embers rose and fell in slow rhythm, a movement that asked for nothing more than observation. In his hands rested his journal, closed now, its pages already filled with years of careful record. Tonight it remained unopened. Holmes sat across from him, still and composed, his presence as unobtrusive as the furniture around him. If not for the occasional shift of his gaze, or the faint rise and fall of his breath, he might have seemed carved into the room itself. Watson studied his friend without urgency. Over time he had learned that Holmes's silences were rarely empty. They carried weight, not of secrecy, but of choice. Holmes spoke when words served a purpose. Tonight, silence served better. Watson reflected quietly. He had walked beside Holmes through danger, confusion, and triumph. He had seen him animated by discovery and sharpened by pursuit. Yet this calm, this measured stillness, was something new. Not withdrawal, not resignation, but a form of readiness that did not demand action. "Do you remember," Watson said at last, his voice low and even, "the first time we sat together in this room?" Holmes's eyes shifted toward him. "I do," he said. "You were assessing the space for practicality. I was assessing you." Watson allowed a small smile. "I was wondering whether I could tolerate your habits." "And I," Holmes replied, "whether you could tolerate my methods." The fire gave a soft crackle, then settled again. Watson leaned back, letting the memory rest where it was. "This room has seen many nights," he said, "some louder than others." "Yes," Holmes agreed, "and it has endured them all." Watson's gaze moved slowly around the space, the familiar shelves, the well-worn chair, the violin resting quietly at its place. There was comfort here, not because it was unchanged, but because it had adapted without losing its shape. "You seem," Watson said carefully, "remarkably at ease." Holmes considered the observation without defensiveness. "Ease," he said, "comes from alignment, when thought and outcome cease to argue." Watson nodded, though the words settled in him slowly. "And if the outcome is uncertain?" Holmes's expression remained calm. "Uncertainty does not preclude acceptance," he replied. "It merely removes illusion." The clock marked another hour. Evening deepened. The street outside grew quieter, footsteps fewer, voices softer. Watson felt a gentle pull toward rest, not sleep exactly, but a loosening of vigilance. He allowed it, trusting the room, trusting the presence across from him. "There is something," Watson said, after a long pause. "You're not saying?" Holmes met his gaze. "Yes." Watson waited, knowing better than to press. "It is not withheld out of secrecy," Holmes added. "Only timing." "I understand," Watson said, and he did. What mattered was not the shape of what lay ahead, but the steadiness with which Holmes faced it. There was reassurance in that, even if the destination remained unnamed. Watson rested his hands on the arms of the chair, grounding himself in the familiar texture of the wood. "Whatever path narrows," he said quietly, echoing Holmes's earlier words, "it does not narrow alone." Holmes inclined his head, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than sentiment. The fire continued its low murmur. Outside, the fog thickened once more, wrapping Baker Street in gentle obscurity. Watson's thoughts slowed, no longer moving in lines or questions, but drifting softly, like the fog itself. He felt no fear, only a quiet awareness at some chapter's close, not with finality, but with composure. He glanced once more at Holmes, who sat with eyes half-lowered, attentive, without strain, present without effort. This, Watson realized, was what loyalty looked like in stillness, not declaration, not urgency, simply remaining. The night drew on. Lamps were lit again beyond the window. Somewhere far off, carriage passed, its sound fading almost before it fully arrived. Within 2021, nothing demanded change. Two men shared the quiet, allowing the evening to unfold at its own pace, untroubled by what it carried with it. And in that shared stillness, the room held them gently, witness to another calm moment before the world resumed its motion. Night returned to London without ceremony. It did not arrive suddenly, nor did it announce itself with darkness. Instead, it slipped gently between the hours, softening the edges of the city until streets, buildings, and people all seemed to move with quieter intention. Baker Street lay wrapped once more in fog. From the upper window of 221B, the street appeared distant and abstract, its familiar lines blurred into gentle shapes. The lamps glowed steadily, each one a small island of warmth in a sea of gray. The fog drifted slowly, never hurried, as though it had nowhere else to be. Inside, the sitting room remained unchanged. Sherlock Holmes stood near the window, hands resting lightly behind his back. His posture was relaxed, his breathing even. He was not watching for movement, nor listening for footsteps. His attention was broader than that, tuned not to events, but to patterns. Watson sat nearby, observing in silence. He had learned that there were times when questions disrupted rather than clarified. This was one of those times. The clock ticked steadily. Holmes spoke without turning. Pressure does not always arrive as force, he said. Often it arrives as absence. Watson listened carefully. When familiar routes close quietly, Holmes continued, when expected signals fail to appear, it creates a narrowing, not abrupt, subtle. Watson nodded slowly. And this narrowing, he said, you feel it now? Yes, Holmes replied, but feeling is not discomfort, it is awareness. He shifted slightly, gazing down at the street below. A lone figure passed beneath the lamp, its outline softened by fog, then disappeared again into nothingness. There is no pursuit tonight, Holmes said, no watchers in the obvious sense. Watson frowned faintly. That seems unusual. It is, Holmes agreed, which is why it is effective. He turned from the window and crossed the room, settling into his chair with unhurried ease. When attention withdraws, Holmes said, it is rarely because interest has faded. More often, it has become complete. Watson considered this in silence. So the web tightens, he said finally, by becoming invisible. Holmes allowed a faint smile. Precisely. The fire murmured quietly, its warmth constant, reassuring. Shadows moved slowly along the walls, stretching and shrinking with each subtle shift of flame. Watson felt no urgency rise within him. Holmes's calm was steadying, anchoring. Whatever forces moved unseen beyond the fog, they did not intrude here. There are moments, Holmes said, when resistance introduces unnecessary turbulence. Clarity lies in stillness. Watson leaned back, letting the words settle. Is there nothing to be done? He asked. Holmes considered the question carefully. There is much to be done, he said, just not yet. Timing matters. The room grew quieter still, as though even the walls listened. Outside, the fog thickened, then thinned, breathing in slow rhythm with the night. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck the hour, its sound arriving muted and softened, then fading away. Holmes closed his eyes briefly. "Movement," he said softly, "will come when it serves purpose. Until then, remaining visible is unnecessary." Watson glanced toward the door, then back at Holmes. "You expect attention to return?" "Yes," Holmes said, "but not here." Watson absorbed this without alarm. "Then this room," he said, "is a pause." "Exactly," Holmes replied. "A place beyond the immediate web." The fire shifted, sending a gentle wave of warmth through the room. Watson felt his muscles loosen, his breath slow. There was comfort in the ordinary, the familiar chairs, the worn carpet, the quiet presence of another mind at rest. The extraordinary, whatever form it took, seemed distant and abstract, as though it belonged to another world entirely. Holmes opened his eyes again, his gaze steady. "Pressure that tightens slowly," he said, "allows adaptation. Panic belongs only to those who do not see it coming." Watson smiled faintly. "And you have seen it for some time?" "Yes," Holmes answered simply. The night deepened. The street outside grew quieter, fewer silhouettes passing beneath the lamps. The fog wrapped the city in patient stillness. Within 221B, nothing demanded response. The web, unseen and unspoken, continued its gradual adjustment, threads drawing closer, paths narrowing with precision rather than force. And Holmes, aware but untroubled, allowed the moment to remain exactly as it was. For now, there was warmth. For now, there was quiet. For now, there was time. And Baker Street rested calmly at the center of it all, untouched by urgency, held gently between awareness and rest as the night carried on its slow, deliberate course. Morning came quietly, as though London itself wished not to interrupt what had already been set in motion. The fog had thinned during the night, leaving behind a pale, diffused light that softened every surface it touched. Baker Street looked almost unfamiliar in this gentle clarity, its edges less defined, its usual urgency absent. Inside 221B, the rooms stirred without haste. Sherlock Holmes stood near the small table, fastening his coat with deliberate ease. There was no sense of departure in his movements, no tension, no final glance meant to hold memory. Each action followed naturally from the last, as though he were simply continuing a thought begun long ago. Dr. Watson watched from the doorway of the adjoining room. "You are certain," Watson said quietly, "that this is necessary?" Holmes nodded, not pausing in his movements. "Necessary," he replied, "and timely." He lifted his hat, then set it down again, adjusting its position slightly. The suitcase by the chair was modest, its contents carefully chosen, free of excess. "There is no pursuit," Watson said. "No visible pressure." Holmes smiled faintly. "Visibility," he said, "is rarely a measure of presence." Watson accepted this, though a familiar tightness settled briefly in his chest. He had grown accustomed to Holmes's sudden departures, yet this one felt different, not urgent, but conclusive in a way that resisted definition. The fire had been extinguished earlier, leaving only cool ash in the grate. The room felt no colder for it. Instead, it seemed to breathe more freely, as though it understood that warmth could be carried elsewhere. Holmes paused by the window, gazing once more at the street below. Few early passers-by moved along the pavement, their figures unremarkable, their intentions unknown and unimportant. "London," Holmes said softly, "is a city of intersections. Paths cross endlessly here. Sometimes clarity requires fewer crossings. Watson stepped closer. And where does clarity lie now? Beyond proximity, Holmes replied. Distance sharpens certain truths. He turned then, meeting Watson's gaze with calm assurance. There is no danger in departure, Holmes added. Only transition. Watson nodded slowly. I will come with you. Holmes inclined his head. I expected nothing less. They moved through the familiar hallway without pause. Each step echoed softly, not as a farewell, but as acknowledgement. The door opened, admitting the cool morning air, carrying with it the faint scent of damp stone and waking streets. Baker Street lay open before them, no longer concealed by fog, yet still hushed. The lamps had been extinguished. Day had taken their place. They walked without hurry. A carriage waited them at the corner, its driver patient, its presence unremarkable. Holmes stepped inside first, settling easily, as though he had always intended to be exactly there, at exactly this moment. Watson followed, the door closing gently behind him. As the carriage moved forward, Baker Street slipped quietly from view. There was no sense of loss, only the subtle shift that comes when one leaves a room, knowing it will remain unchanged. Holmes sat opposite Watson, hands resting calmly in his lap. His gaze remained outward, attentive without fixation. The city, Holmes said, will continue without notice. That is its strength. Watson watched the streets pass, shops opening, figures gathering momentum as the day advanced. And you? Watson asked. I will continue as well, Holmes replied, only elsewhere. The carriage rolled on, wheels steady against the stones. Sound blended into rhythm, thought slowed. The station, the air carried a different quality, movement contained within order. Steam rose in gentle clouds, dissipating without force. Voices remained low, purposeful, unhurried. Holmes stepped down and moved forward, blending easily into the flow. There was nothing about him that invited attention. He carried no urgency, no secrecy, only composure. They boarded the train without delay. Holmes selected a seat by the window, setting his belongings neatly beside him. As the train prepared to depart, Watson glanced back once more toward the city. London rested behind them now, not abandoned, not escaped, simply set aside. A whistle sounded, not sharply, but with restrained clarity. The train began to move. Holmes watched the platform slide away, his expression unchanged. Departure, he said quietly, is not disappearance. Watson settled back, allowing the steady motion to ease his thoughts. Outside, the city gave way to quieter spaces. Buildings thinned, streets softened. The rhythm of the train became a gentle constant, smoothing the edges of awareness. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, not to sleep, but to rest within motion. The web Holmes had spoken of remained unseen, but its presence no longer pressed inward. Distance had altered its shape, transforming tension into alignment. For now, there was movement without effort. For now, there was direction without urgency. For now, London receded calmly into memory, and the train carried them forward, not away from something feared, but towards something understood, along a path that no longer required resistance, only steady, measured progress into the quiet unfolding of what was to come. The train moved steadily through the outskirts of the city, its rhythm smooth and unbroken. Holmes and Watson sat in companionable quiet, allowing the gentle motion to carry their thoughts forward without insistence. Fields replaced brickwork. The noise of London faded into a distant memory, softened further with every passing mile. Holmes gazed through the window, his attention resting not on specific landmarks, but on the continuity of motion itself. The landscape unfolded in muted tones, hedgerows, open ground, the occasional cluster of buildings, each appearing briefly before yielding to the next. Watson felt the familiar sense of transition settle over him. Travel had always carried this quality, the quiet suspension between places, where the mind loosened its hold on certainty and allowed itself to drift. Movement, Holmes said softly, as if continuing an unspoken thought, simplifies perception. Watson nodded. Distance, Holmes continued, removes unnecessary detail. What remains is structure. The train slowed as it approached the coast. The air seemed to change, carrying with it a faint trace of salt and openness. When they disembarked, the sky stretched wide above them, pale and unobtrusive, offering no drama. The harbor lay calm. Water rested against the hulls of waiting vessels with gentle persistence, rising and falling without effort. Steam curled lazily from the ship that would carry them onward, dissipating almost as soon as it formed. Holmes stood at the rail for a moment, observing without analysis. "The sea," he said, "has no interest in intention. It accepts passage or denies it without judgment." Watson found comfort in the thought. They boarded without ceremony. The ship moved away from shore gradually, as though reluctant to disturb the stillness of the morning. The coastline receded, not sharply, but in softened layers, until it became indistinct and finally dissolved into horizon. Holmes leaned lightly against the railing, his coat unmoving in the mild air. There was no tension in him now, only a calm attentiveness, as though each moment was being received rather than anticipated. Watson stood beside him, watching the water. "There is a strange peace in this," Watson said quietly. Holmes inclined his head. "Transitional spaces," he replied, "often provide the clearest thought." The ship settled into its course. Engines hummed with restrained consistency. The sea stretched outward in all directions, a surface of muted gray-blue, broken only by slow, deliberate waves. Time loosened. Watson felt his breathing align with the motion beneath his feet. Each rise and fall of the water echoed gently within him, smoothing the edges of thought. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, allowing the rhythm to pass through him without resistance. "There is no pursuit here," Holmes said after a while. "No compression, only movement." Watson glanced around. Passengers stood quietly or remained seated, absorbed in their own inward journeys. No one paid them particular attention. There was comfort in anonymity. The horizon remained steady. Holmes opened his eyes again, his gaze unfocused, resting somewhere beyond the visible. "When opposing forces move with equal clarity," he said, "conflict becomes unnecessary. Resolution follows naturally." Watson did not ask what form that resolution might take. The question felt misplaced here. Amid water and sky, clouds drifted slowly overhead, their shapes indistinct, their presence gentle. The light shifted subtly, never demanding notice. The ship continued forward, unhurried. Watson felt the familiar world recede, not in loss, but in quiet detachment. London felt distant now, not just in space, but in weight. Its concerns no longer pressed inward. Holmes remained composed, his posture relaxed, his attention broad rather than fixed. "This crossing," Holmes said softly, "is not an escape." Watson smiled faintly. "No," he agreed. "It feels more like alignment." Holmes returned the smile, subtle and brief. The sea carried them onward. Waves met the hull with steady consistency, a sound that neither startled nor faded, simply existed. The air remained cool and clean, free of the closeness of streets and walls. Watson allowed his thoughts to drift. unstructured and unburdened. There was nothing to plan, nothing to anticipate. The present moment required no interpretation. Holmes rested one hand lightly on the railing, feeling the vibration of movement beneath it. Clarity, he said, often arrives when one stops pressing for it. The words settled easily. At first began to take shape, first as suggestion, then as softened outline. There was no sense of arrival, only continuation. The ship did not announce its progress, it simply maintained it. Holmes straightened slightly, adjusting his coat with calm precision. "Land will return," he said. "It always does." Watson watched as the coastline grew nearer, still distant enough to remain abstract. The crossing had altered something subtle but essential. The web Holmes had spoken of no longer felt enclosing. It had expanded, reshaped by distance and motion. For now, there was water beneath them. For now, there was sky above. For now, there was nothing to do but continue. And so they stood quietly as the ship moved forward, carried by steady forces that required no struggle, no resistance, only acceptance of motion and the gentle certainty that the journey itself was enough. The train resumed its gentle course inland, carrying Holmes and Watson away from the sea and deeper into the continent. The motion was steady and reassuring, a continuation rather than a beginning. Fields stretched outward in wide open plains, their colors muted by distance and light. Villages appeared briefly, then slipped away again, leaving only the impression of roofs, church towers, and narrow roads winding calmly between them. Holmes sat by the window, his posture relaxed, his attention broad and unforced. The glass reflected the passing world in soft layers, merging movement with stillness. He did not follow landmarks or calculate speed. Instead, he allowed the rhythm of travel to guide his awareness. Watson sat opposite, hands folded loosely, watching the countryside unfold. There was a comfort in being carried forward without effort, each mile passed without demand, without urgency. "Europe," Holmes said, quietly, as though speaking to the motion itself, "reveals itself best when not examined too closely." Watson nodded. "Details distract," Holmes continued. "Structure remains." The train passed through a forested stretch. Trees rose and then fell in slow succession, their trunks blurring into vertical lines, their leaves forming a continuous canopy of green, gray calm. Light filtered through intermittently, creating a gentle pattern that repeated without variation. Watson felt his thoughts soften, losing their edges. The steady sound of wheels on track became a constant, a low, rhythmic presence that required no attention. "This," Watson said after some time, "feels unlike any journey we have taken." Holmes inclined his head. "Purpose alters perception," he replied. "When arrival matters less, the passage becomes clearer." The train slowed as it approached a small station. Few passengers stepped off, their movements unhurried, their expressions neutral. Others boarded just as quietly. There were no greetings exchanged beyond polite nods. Life continued without spectacle. The train moved on. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, not to sleep, but to rest within motion. The web he had spoken of no longer pressed inward. Distance had reshaped it, stretching its lines until they felt less confining, more expensive. Outside, the landscape shifted gradually. Fields gave way to gentle hills. Roads curved with intention rather than haste. The sky remained overcast, but light, offering neither brilliance nor gloom. Watson felt an unusual calm settle over him, a sense that the world, at least for now, required nothing from him. He allowed himself to simply observe. "There are regions," Holmes said softly, "where time moves differently, not slower, but with fewer interruptions." Watson glanced at him. This feels like one of them. Yes, Holmes replied. Transit creates such regions. The train entered a long stretch of countryside untouched by towns. The horizon widened. The sense of enclosure faded further. Watson leaned back, listening to the quiet consistency of travel. Do you ever, Watson asked gently, grow tired of movement? Holmes considered the question. I grow tired of stagnation, he said. Movement, when unforced, is restorative. Watson smiled faintly. They passed a river, its surface smooth and reflective, mirroring the pale sky above. For a moment, the train and its reflection moved together, parallel and calm. Holmes opened his eyes again, watching the water recede. Paths, he said, do not always reveal their significance at the moment they are taken. Watson absorbed the thought without pressing further. The train continued on. Afternoon shifted gradually toward evening, not with sharp contrast, but with softened light and lengthening shadows. Lamps within the carriage glowed faintly, their presence subtle and unobtrusive. Passengers grew quieter, conversations fading into low murmurs or silence. Many rested, eyes closed, minds drifting. Watson felt the same gentle pull. His thoughts slowed, loosening their grip on sequence and consequence. Holmes remained composed, present, without effort. His gaze rested outward, then inward, then nowhere in particular. This journey, Holmes said, is not about distance covered. Watson waited. It is about balance restored. The words settled easily. Outside, the land began to rise more noticeably. Hills grew steeper, their slopes darker against the sky. The air felt cooler, even through the glass, as though the earth itself were preparing for altitude. Watson noticed the change without comment. The train moved on, untroubled by the gradual shift. Its rhythm remained constant, indifferent to terrain. Europe passed by, not as a destination, but as a sequence of quiet impressions. Fields, forests, rivers, hills, each contributing without demanding attention. For now, there was no urgency. For now, there was no need to arrive. For now, there was only the steady passage through a landscape that asked nothing and offered calm in return. And so the train carried them onward, deeper into stillness, as evening settled gently over the continent, and the journey continued in unbroken, unhurried flow. The transition was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. The land had been rising for hours, though the change revealed itself only in subtle ways, the air growing cooler, the sky widening, the light thinning into a clearer, paler tone. Then, without announcement, the mountains began to appear. They did not rise suddenly or dramatically. Instead, they revealed themselves layer by layer, distant forms emerging from the horizon like quiet thoughts surfacing into awareness. Their outlines were softened by haze, their presence suggested before it was fully seen. Holmes noticed them before Watson spoke. The landscape, Holmes said softly, has begun to speak in longer sentences. Watson turned toward the window. At first, the Alps seemed almost unreal, too still, too composed, to belong to the same moving world as the train. Peaks rose calmly beyond valleys, their slopes dark with forest and stone, their upper reaches pale and undefined against the sky. Watson felt his breath slow. There is a stillness to them, he said. Holmes nodded. Altitude, he replied, clarifies proportion. The train continued its steady course, now threading through valleys that narrowed gently, guiding the tracks between slopes that rose with patient certainty. The sound of the wheels echoed differently here, deeper, more resonant, as though the mountains themselves were listening. Outside, rivers appeared more frequently, their waters clear and purposeful. moving without haste, yet without hesitation. They followed paths shaped over time, never resisting the land, only adapting to it. Watson watched as a river curved alongside the tracks for a time, then slicked away again. "There is no struggle here," he said quietly. "No," Holmes agreed, "only inevitability." The air inside the carriage felt cooler now, fresher. Windows reflected the mountains in soft overlays, blending interior calm with exterior grandeur. Holmes sat with hands folded loosely, his posture unchanged. The scale of the landscape did not diminish him, nor did it elevate him. He observed it as one observes something long anticipated. "These forms," Holmes said, "have no interest in urgency." Lara lasted. Watson nodded, fooling the truth of the statement without analysis. The train entered a tunnel, its passage brief and smooth. Darkness enveloped the carriage momentarily, then gave way again to light, and the mountains appeared closer now, more defined, their details clearer. Forests climbed their lower slopes, dense and orderly. Higher still, rock emerged, stark and unadorned. Above that, snow lingered in quiet patches, untouched and unconcerned. Watson felt a sense of grounding, as though the sheer presence of the land had gently recalibrated his thoughts. "There is comfort," he said, "in something that does not respond to us." Holmes smiled faintly. "Yes," he said, "indifference can be reassuring." The train slowed slightly as it navigated the terrain, not out of strain, but respect. Its motion remained smooth, deliberate. Villages appeared briefly, clusters of wooden structures nestled into valleys, smoke rising gently from chimneys, windows reflecting pale afternoon light. Life persisted here without spectacle, aligned with the contours of the land rather than imposed upon it. Watson observed one such village pass by, its presence quiet and complete. "These places," he said, "feel settled." "They are," Holmes replied. "They have learned where not to build." The afternoon light shifted again, angling lower, painting the slopes in softer contrast. Shadows lengthened without drama. The sky remained clear but subdued, offering no brilliance. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, resting within the steadiness of the scene. "The mind," he said, "mirrors its surroundings when allowed." Watson felt his thoughts align with the landscape, slower, broader, less insistent. The train curved through another valley, revealing a waterfall in the distance, its white line descending steadily from high stone to unseen depths. It did not roar from here. It simply existed, continuous and certain. Watson followed it with his eyes until it disappeared behind trees. "Water," Holmes said, "understands descent." Watson smiled faintly. The train continued on, drawing nearer to the heart of the mountains. Peaks rose higher now, their presence more immediate. The world felt quieter here, as though sound itself respected the scale. Even the train seemed to lower its voice. Watson leaned back, letting the scenery pass without effort. The Alps did not demand attention. They invited it, gently. "This," Watson said softly, "feels like arrival." Holmes opened his eyes. "Proximity," he said, "not conclusion." The words settled easily. The mountains held their place as the train moved onward, untroubled by motion, unchanged by observation. They had been here long before, and they would remain long after. For now, there was clarity in their presence. For now, there was calm in their scale. For now, there was nothing to do but continue. And so the train carried them deeper into the alpine landscape, as peaks watched in patient silence, and the journey moved forward with the same steady certainty as the land itself. The train slowed gradually, its rhythm easing rather than stopping, as though it too recognized the nature of the place it approached. The mountains no longer felt distant or observational. They stood close now, enclosing the valley with a presence that was neither oppressive nor dramatic, but gently protective. When the train came to rest, it did so without urgency. Holmes stepped down onto the platform first, his movements unhurried, his expression unchanged. Watson followed, feeling at once the difference in the air. It was cooler here, thinner, yet somehow fuller, carrying the quiet scent of stone, pine, and distant water. The station was small, clean, orderly. No crowds gathered. No voices rose above the level of calm conversation. A few passengers disembarked, each moving with deliberate ease, as though time itself moved more slowly in this place. Beyond the platform, the village waited. It rested in the valley, as though it had always belonged there, shaped carefully to the land rather than imposed upon it. Wooden chalets lined the narrow road, their roofs sloping gently, their windows reflecting the pale alpine light. Smoke rose lazily from a few chimneys, dissolving almost immediately into the cool air. Holmes paused for a moment, taking in the scene without analysis. "This," he said quietly, "the place that understands restraint." Watson nodded, absorbing the stillness. They walked slowly along the path leading away from the station. Their footsteps made little sound on the packed earth and stone. There was no need to speak. The village revealed itself gradually, one detail at a time. Small bridge crossed a narrow stream, its water clear and steady, moving with soft determination over smooth stones. Holmes paused briefly to watch it. "Flow," he said, without resistance. Watson smiled faintly. The inn stood a short distance beyond the bridge. It was modest, its sign weathered, but well cared for, its presence understated. Warm light glowed softly through the windows, offering welcome without invitation. Inside, the air held a gentle warmth. The scent of wood and clean linen settled easily. The innkeeper greeted them quietly. Words exchanged without flourish. Keys were handed over, directions given. Nothing more was required. Their room was simple: 2 beds, a small table, a window that looked out toward the mountains, now darkening as evening approached. The stillness of the place felt complete, not lacking. Holmes set his belongings down neatly, then crossed to the window. "The world," he said, "feels different when sound carries farther." Watson joined him. Outside, the village settled into evening. Lamps were lit, one by one, their light soft and contained. Somewhere, a bell rang, not sharply, but as a gentle marking of time. "There is no urgency here," Watson said. "No," Holmes agreed. Urgency would feel out of place. They dined simply. Conversation remained minimal, not from lack of thought, but from lack of necessity. The food was warm and grounding. The quiet of the room allowed each movement to feel intentional. Later, back in their room, Watson sat by the window while Holmes stood nearby, gazing outward. The mountains loomed in shadow now, their outlines softened by dusk. Above them, the sky deepened into a muted blue, stars beginning to appear, not brightly, but patiently. "This village," Holmes said, "exists in balance. It takes only what it needs." Watson considered the statement. "And gives nothing away unnecessarily." "Precisely," Holmes replied. Watson felt a subtle sense of grounding, as though the land itself had reached inward and steadied him. There was no sense of danger here, no pressure, only quiet presence. Holmes removed his coat and set it aside, his movements measured and calm. "Tonight," he said, "there is nothing to anticipate." Watson nodded. The beds were simple, but comfortable. The room held warmth without heaviness. As Watson lay back, he listened to the faint sounds of the village settling, the distant murmur of voices, the soft closing of doors, the whisper of wind moving through trees. Holmes remained awake a while longer, seated by the window, his gaze resting not on any particular point, but on the valley as a whole. There was no tension in him, only attentiveness. Eventually he too rested, allowing the quiet of the village to carry the night forward. Outside, the mountains remained unchanged, their presence steady and untroubled. The village slept within their shelter, held gently between stone and sky. For now there was rest. For now there was stillness. For now there was nothing to solve. And the quiet village, nestled deep within the Alps, accepted the night without resistance, offering its calm freely to all who passed through its narrow paths and gentle hours. Morning arrived in the village without sound. There was no rush of light, no sudden change in temperature. Instead, the day revealed itself gradually, as though it had always been present and was only now being noticed. Pale sunlight slipped gently over the mountain ridges, settling into the valley with quiet certainty. Holmes woke early. He sat upright for a moment, attentive to the stillness, listening not for disturbance, but for balance. The room held its shape from the night before, unchanged, unburdened. Watson slept on, his breathing slow and even, carried by the calm altitude and quiet hours. Holmes rose without sound and crossed to the window. The village lay below in peaceful order. Roofs caught the first light, their edges softened by distance. Smoke rose thinly from a single chimney, drifting upward before dissolving into the morning air. Beyond the village, the mountains stood in silent arrangement, their presence complete and unassertive. Holmes rested his hand lightly against the window frame. There is a clarity, he thought, that arrives when nothing presses inward. The thought passed without attachment. Outside, a narrow path wound upward from the village, disappearing briefly behind trees before re-emerging higher along the slope. Holmes followed it with his eyes, not tracing its destination, only acknowledging its existence. Paths did not require purpose to be valid. They existed because the land allowed them. Watson stirred eventually, waking slowly, without disorientation. He sat up and took in the room, then noticed Holmes by the window. "You have been awake for some time," Watson said quietly. Holmes nodded. "The morning invited attention," he replied. Watson joined him at the window, allowing the view to settle his thoughts. "It feels," Watson said after a while, "as though the world is holding itself together here." Holmes inclined his head. "Balance," he said, "is most visible where nothing is forced." They dressed without hurry and descended to the inn's dining room. Breakfast was simple and unremarkable in the best possible way. Warm bread, fresh fruit, tea served without ceremony. Conversation around them remained low, respectful of the hour. Afterward, they stepped outside. The air was cool and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine and stone. Holmes adjusted his coat and began walking along the path leading upward from the village. Watson followed, his pace unhurried, his thoughts quiet. The path rose gently, never steep, never demanding. It curved naturally with the terrain, revealing new perspectives without effort. As they climbed, the village receded, not disappearing, but settling comfortably into the landscape. Holmes walked with even steps, his posture relaxed. There was no vigilance in him now, no scanning of surroundings. He was present in the movement, nothing more. They paused at a clearing where the valley opened fully beneath them. The village lay small and orderly below, held securely within the wide bowl of the mountains. Holmes stood still. "This," he said softly, "is equilibrium." Watson felt the truth of it without analysis. "There is no tension here," Watson said. "No anticipation." "No," Holmes replied, "only presence." They remained there for some time, allowing the quiet to deepen rather than fill. The wind moved lightly through the trees, a sound more like breath than motion. Somewhere far off, water moved steadily over stone. Holmes closed his eyes. In this place, thought did not fragment, it widened. Past and future loosened their hold, becoming less distinct, less demanding. "There are moments," Holmes said quietly, "when understanding no longer requires fervor." Watson nodded. "And you are in such a moment now." "Yes." They resumed their walk, eventually turning back toward the village. The descent felt as natural as the climb, requiring no adjustment. As they returned, the village had fully awakened. Doors stood open. Quiet tasks were underway. Life continued in measured rhythm, neither hurried nor delayed. Holmes observed, without intrusion. "People here," he said, "have learned where stillness belongs." Watson smiled faintly. They spent the afternoon without structure. Holmes read it briefly, then set the book aside. Watson wrote a few lines in his journal, then closed it again. Neither felt compelled to fill the hours. As evening approached, the light softened once more. Shadows lengthened across the valley. The mountains deepened in color, their outlines calm and certain. Holmes stood again at the window as night returned, his reflection faint against the darkened glass. "There is no unrest," Watson said quietly from behind him. "No," Holmes agreed, "and no resistance." The fire downstairs murmured softly. The village settled once more into rest. For the first time in a long while, Holmes felt no need to anticipate movement. The path ahead remained unseen, but it no longer pressed for recognition. For now, there was balance. For now, there was stillness. For now, there lay peace. And the mountains, indifferent yet protective, held the night in steady silence, as Holmes allowed himself to rest fully within the quiet certainty of the present moment. The day did not announce its significance. Morning unfolded in the village exactly as it had before. Soft light, cool air, the steady presence of mountains, holding the valley in quiet symmetry. Nothing suggested change, nothing needed to, yet awareness does not require disturbance. Holmes sensed it not as a warning, nor as shift in atmosphere, but as a subtle convergence, like two lines that had long been moving toward one another, finally acknowledging their shared direction. He stood by the window, observing the familiar outlines of rooftops and paths, unchanged and unconcerned. Watson rested nearby, awake but unhurried, turning pages of his journal without urgency. "There is a difference," Holmes said softly, "between arrival and approach." Watson looked up. "This," Holmes continued, "is approach." There was no tension in his voice, no caution, only recognition. Watson considered the word carefully. "And does approach require preparation?" Holmes shook his head. "Preparation implies uncertainty," he said. "This does not." They left the inn after breakfast and followed the same path as the day before, winding gently upward through trees and stone. The air carried the faint sound of water somewhere unseen, moving steadily through the valley. Holmes walked with the same even pace, but Watson noticed something subtle, an alignment in him that felt complete, as though a long-held internal balance had finally settled. The path narrowed slightly as it rose, not steeply, not restrictively, only enough to guide movement with intention. Trees grew closer together here, their branches allowing light to pass through in soft, scattered patterns. Holmes paused briefly, resting his hand against the rough surface of a stone wall lining the path. Some presences, he said, do not announce themselves with motion. Watson waited. They announce themselves with precision. Watson felt the meaning settle without unease. You feel him, Watson said quietly. Holmes nodded. Yes, the name was not spoken. It did not need to be. They continued upward till the village fell fully out of sight, replaced by open slope and distant peaks. The valley widened, revealing layers of mountain beyond mountain, each one quieter than the last. Holmes stood still. There is no pursuit, he said, no closing distance in the physical sense. Watson looked around. Then where is the movement? In understanding, Holmes replied. Mutual recognition. Watson absorbed this without fear. Whatever lay ahead felt inevitable, but not threatening, like the final note of a melody resolving exactly where it must. The wind moved gently across the slope, carrying no chill, no urgency. Clouds passed slowly overhead, reshaping the light without drama. Holmes closed his eyes briefly. There is respect, he said softly, in acknowledging an equal. Watson felt the weight of those words, not heavy, but complete. You do not intend to avoid this, Watson said. No, Holmes replied. Avoidance would be distortion. They began the descent, returning toward the village, the same calm rhythm. The path widened again, welcoming rather than releasing them. By the time they reached the lower slopes, the village had resumed its quiet patterns. Doors opened, footsteps passed. Life continued without awareness of alignment or convergence. Holmes watched it all with gentle detachment. The world, he said, does not pause for resolution. Watson nodded. And yet, Watson said, resolution comes regardless. Yes. The afternoon passed without structure. Holmes sat by the inn's window, watching clouds shift along the peaks. Watson rested nearby, allowing thoughts to drift rather than organize. There was no discussion of plans, no mention of movement. As evening approached, a stillness settled that felt slightly deeper than before, not heavier, just more complete. Holmes stood once more at the window as dusk softened the valley. It will not happen suddenly, he said. Watson joined him. No, Watson agreed. Nothing here does. The mountains darkened gently, their outlines firm against the deepening sky. Stars emerged slowly, without brilliance, without haste. Holmes remained composed. There is no fear in convergence, he said quietly, only final clarity. Watson felt the truth of it settle within him. They retired for the night without ceremony. The room held its calm shape, unchanged by awareness. As Watson lay back, sleep arrived naturally, unforced. Holmes remained awake little longer, seated in stillness, his thoughts neither reaching forward nor backward. The approach continued, not in steps, not in distance, but in understanding. For now there was calm. For now there was balance. For now there was certainty without urgency. And the mountains held their quiet watch, unchanged and untroubled, as two paths, long aligned, continued toward their inevitable meeting, without haste, without resistance, and without fear. Morning arrived with a deeper clarity than before. The air felt cooler, more precise, as though the valley itself had settled into a quieter register. Light moved carefully along the slopes, revealing stone, water, and shadow with equal restraint. The sound of water was present before it was seen. It was not loud, not forceful. It existed as a constant undertone, steady and uninterrupted, threading its way through the stillness of the mountains. Holmes noticed it as he stood by the window, listening without strain. Water, he said softly, announces persistence. Watson joined him, following the direction of Holmes's gaze toward the distant gorge where mist rose faintly into the air. "That must be the falls," Watson said. "Yes," Holmes replied. "Reichenbach." They set out later that morning, leaving the village behind without ceremony. The path leading toward the falls was bell-worn but quiet, shaped by time rather than traffic. It guided them gently upward and inward, toward a place the mountains had long prepared. The sound of water grew clearer as they walked, not louder, but more defined. Each step brought greater distinction, greater presence, without urgency. Holmes moved steadily, his pace even, his posture relaxed. Watson walked beside him, aware of the subtle shift in the air, the way it cooled, the way it carried moisture and stone. "This path," Watson said, "feels inevitable." Holmes nodded. "It has been walked," he said, "by intention rather than chance." The gorge revealed itself gradually. Stone walls rose on either side, baked smooth by centuries of water. Mist hung lightly in the air, softening the edges of the world without, obscuring it. They reached a vantage point where the falls could be seen fully. Water plunged downward in a continuous white motion, striking rock below before disappearing into unseen depths. Mist rose steadily, catching the light and dissolving it into pale halos. Holmes stood still. The falls did not roar. They spoke in constancy. "There is no struggle here," Holmes said quietly. "Only completion of motion." Watson felt the truth of it settle within him. The falls were powerful, but not aggressive. They did not rush. They did not hesitate. They simply continued. They moved closer along the path, stopping where the gorge narrowed, and the water's presence filled the space without overwhelming it. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of stone and motion. Holmes rested his hands lightly on the railing. "This," he said, "is where convergence becomes visible." Watson glanced around. "There is no one else here." "No," Holmes replied, "nor need there be." The mist moved slowly, reshaping the view without altering it. Sound remained constant, smoothing thought rather than interrupting it. Watson felt a quiet weight settle, not heavy, not foreboding, but complete. "You are calm," Watson said. Holmes smiled faintly. "Because this place does not demand resolution," he said. "It embodies it." They stood together for some time, allowing the presence of the falls to steady their thoughts. Past and future felt distant here, irrelevant against the continuity of water and stone. Eventually, Holmes spoke again. "There are moments," he said, "when the end of a path is not abrupt." Watson listened. "It narrows," Holmes continued, "until it aligns perfectly with what it was always moving toward." Watson nodded. "This feels like such a moment." "Yes." Holmes turned slightly, his gaze resting not on the water, but on the space where mist thickened and thinned, revealing and concealing in equal measure. "There is no fear here," Holmes said. "Only scale." Watson felt no impulse to speak further. Words seemed unnecessary. The falls continued their motion, unchanged by observation. Mist rose, water descended, stone remained. They turned back slowly, retracing their steps along the path. The sound of the falls remained present for a time, then softened, then faded into the background of the valley. Another man hurried. As they walked, Watson felt the significance of the place settle gently, not as conclusion, but as acknowledgement. Whatever lay ahead had already been recognized. They returned to the village as evening approached. Lamps were lighted, doors closed softly. Life resumed its quiet rhythm. Holmes paused once more at the edge of the path and looked back toward the direction of the falls. now unseen but unmistakably present. Some places, he said, do not need revisiting. Watson understood. That night, the sound of water lingered faintly in the distance, carried on the air like a steady breath. Sleep arrived without resistance, guided by the certainty that the path, having revealed itself, no longer required question. For now, there was calm. For now, there was craftsmanship. For now, there was no need to move further. And Reichenbach Falls continued its endless descent, unchanged and untroubled, a quiet testament to motion that requires no force, only gravity, patience, and time. The path beyond the falls was quieter than any they had walked before. Stone narrowed it gently, guiding movement without pressure. The sound of water remained present, but no longer dominant, now a steady undercurrent rather than a voice. Mist drifted lazily across the trail, thinning and gathering again, as though the air itself were breathing. Holmes walked ahead, not leading, not following, simply moving as the path allowed. Watson kept pace beside him, aware that something had shifted, though nothing outwardly had changed. The mountains held their silence. They reached a natural opening, where the gorge widened slightly, revealing a still stretch of ground near the edge. The falls were visible again here, not in their full descent, but in fragments. White motion glimpsed through mist and stone. Holmes stopped. Watson felt it then. Not tension, not alarm, but presence, the kind that required no sound, no movement. It did not intrude upon the space. It belonged to it. Holmes spoke first, his voice calm, unraised. You have always preferred clarity to concealment. The words were not addressed outward, yet they were unmistakably received. From the edge of the mist, the figure became discernible, not emerging, not approaching, but resolving into focus, as though it had always been there. Its outline was precise, composed, absent of haste. There was no hostility in the air, no urgency, only attention. Clarity, came the reply, measured and restrained, is most effective when it is final. Watson remained still, his breath slow, his thoughts quiet. He did not need to see the man's face clearly to understand the presence before them. It carried intellect rather than emotion, certainty rather than threat. You followed the path exactly, Holmes said, without deviation. There was no need to deviate, the voice answered. The structure was complete. Mist moved between them, briefly softening the space, then clearing again. You understand, Holmes said, that this was never about pursuit. Yes, came the reply. It was about symmetry. Holmes inclined his head slightly. I respect that, as I respect precision, the other responded. Watson felt the exchange settle into the air like a perfectly placed stone, no ripple beyond what was necessary. There are endings, Holmes said, that serve no purpose if prolonged. Agreed. Forthfree continued their descent, unchanged, indifferent to the conversation unfolding beside them. Holmes's posture remained relaxed. There was no defensive stance, no guarded movement. Only presence meeting presence. You could have chosen distance, the voice said. Disappearance. Distance, Holmes replied, would have distorted the balance. Silence followed, not empty, but complete. Watson felt no fear, only a profound stillness, as though the world had narrowed briefly to this precise alignment of minds, place, and moment. There is no conflict here, Holmes said softly. No, came the reply, only resolution. Mist drifted again, catching the light and scattering it into pale fragments. The sound of water deepened momentarily, then returned to its steady cadence. You have always known, the voice said, that such structures conclude themselves. Yes, Holmes answered, and I have always accepted that. Watson's awareness expanded rather than focused. He felt the mountains around them, the depth below, the continuity of water and stone. This was not a confrontation. It was a convergence, quiet, exact, inevitable. There is no need for witnesses, the voice observed. Holmes glanced briefly toward Watson, his expression calm, grateful, unburdened. Some journeys, Holmes said, are shared until their final clarity. Watson understood without pain. The mist thickened again, not obscuring, but softening the outlines of all things equally. Sound remained, presence remained, nothing pressed forward. There will be balance after this, Holmes said. There always is, came the reply. The air felt neither heavy nor light, only resolved. Holmes stepped closer to the edge, not abruptly, not deliberately, simply following the narrowing of the path. The figure opposite did the same, their movements mirrored without effort. Watson remained where he was, grounded, steady, aware that this stillness was not fragile. It required no intervention. There is no triumph here, Holmes said quietly. No, the voice replied. Only completion. For a moment, the mist closed around them both, equalizing all distance. Sound softened. The falls remained, steady and unchanging. When the mist thinned again, the space felt altered, not emptied, but settled. Watson stood alone beside the path. The falls continued their descent. The mountains held their silence. The air moved gently, carrying nothing urgent, nothing unresolved. Watson did not rush forward. He did not call out. There was no need. What had occurred had done so with precision, without disturbance. He remained there for a long while, breathing in the cool air, listening to the water, allowing understanding to arrive without force. Eventually he turned back along the path, each step measured, grounded by the certainty that some conversations do not echo, they conclude. For now, there was quiet. For now, there was balance restored. For now, there was nothing left to say, and the Reichenbach Falls continued unchanged and eternal, as the mountains held the moment gently, allowing it to pass into stillness without resistance. Silence did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded. It spread outward from the gorge in soft layers, like mist settling into still air. The sound of the falls remained, steady and unchanged, yet everything else seemed to withdraw. Footsteps, intention, even the sense of sequence. What remained was not emptiness, but completion. Watson stood where he had been, neither advancing nor retreating. The path before him was unchanged. Stone still curved gently along its edge. Mist still drifted, rising and thinning in slow rhythm. The mountains still held their quiet watch. Nothing appeared altered, and yet everything felt resolved. The space beside him felt full without presence. Watson drew a slow breath, then another. His body responded first, shoulders settling, heartbeat evening, long before thought attempted to follow. There was no shock, no sudden grief, no sharp awareness of loss. Those emotions belonged to moments of disruption. This moment was not disrupted. It was precise. The sound of water moved continuously, smoothing the passage of time. It neither hurried nor lingered. It simply remained. Watson turned his gaze toward the falls. Mist rose in pale sheets, catching light and dissolving it into softness. The descent of water was uninterrupted, unbroken, by witness or consequence. He felt no urge to approach the edge. The place did not invite it. Instead, Watson remained still, allowing the silence to deepen rather than fill. Thoughts arose slowly, without pressure. They did not demand response. They drifted, then settled, like leaves on quiet water. Holmes had often spoken of moments where observation alone was sufficient. Watson understood now. He rested his hand lightly against the stone railing. It was cool beneath his fingers, solid and grounding. The physical certainty of it anchored him gently to the present, reminding him that the world had not fractured. It had simply aligned. The mist shifted again, briefly obscuring the view, then thinning once more. Each movement felt deliberate, unhurried, as though the air itself respected what had occurred. Watson felt no need to retrace the conversation, no urge to analyze what had passed. The exchange had not been meant for reflection. It had been meant for completion. He stood there a long while. Time lost its usual shape. Minutes did not gather into hours. They passed individually, without connection, each one complete on its own. The falls continued. The mountains remained. Eventually, Watson became aware of the path behind him, not as an invitation, but as continuation. The village waited below, unchanged, unaware, held in the same calm rhythm as before. He turned slowly and began to walk. Each step felt steady, grounded, without resistance. The path accepted his movement without comment. Mist thinned as he descended, revealing trees and stone that had been there all along. The sound of the falls softened gradually, receding into background presence rather than absence. It did not disappear. It simply took its place within the wider quiet of the valley. Watson's breathing matched his pace. Thought remained unforced. As he walked, memories surfaced, not sharply, not in sequence, but as impressions. A violin's low note, a fire settling into embers, a fog-dimmed street. Each appeared briefly, then faded, leaving no ache behind. These were not recollections of loss. They were acknowledgments of continuity. At the time the village came into view, evening had begun to settle. Lamps were being lit, one by one, their glow contained and warm. Smoke rose from chimneys, thin and unassertive. Life continued. Watson paused briefly at the edge of the path and looked back toward the mountains. The peaks were darkening now, their outlines firm against the deepening sky. Somewhere beyond them, water continued its descent. There is nothing unfinished, he thought. The realization arrived quietly and remained. He returned to the inn without announcement. The door opened. Warmth greeted him. The innkeeper offered a nod, nothing more. There were no questions. None were required. The room upstairs remained as it had been, simple, orderly, still. Holmes's belongings rested where they had last been placed. There was no sense of intrusion in their presence. They belonged to the space, as everything here did. Watson did not disturb them. He sat by the window as night settled fully into the valley. Stars emerged slowly, without brilliance, scattered lightly across the sky. The mountains held their shape, unmoved by darkness. The village quieted. Doors closed softly. Voices faded. Only the faintest sounds remained. Wind through trees, distant water, the steady rhythm of the night. Watson allowed his thoughts to drift again. Grief did not arrive. Not yet. Not here. This place did not hold grief. It held silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of balance, the kind that follows resolution, not shock, the kind that asks for nothing, demands nothing, explains nothing. Watson rested within it. He lay back eventually, sleep arriving, not as escape, but as continuation. Dreams, if they came, did so without narrative, without image, only sensation, weightless and calm. Outside, the mountains remained, the falls continued, stone endured, silence held. For now, there was no question. For now, there was no pursuit. For now, there was only the gentle certainty that some endings do not echo, they settle. And the night passed over the valley without disturbance, carrying silence forward, not as emptiness, but as completion, allowing the world to continue exactly as it always had, steady, balanced, and at rest. Morning returned to the village as it always had, without announcement and without pause. Pale light slipped gently over the mountains and settled into the valley, touching stone, wood, and water with the same quiet certainty as before. Nothing in the landscape marked the change that had occurred. Watson woke slowly. For a moment, there was only awareness, the weight of the bed, the coolness of the air, the faint sound of movement beyond the window. Thought had not yet formed, and in that brief space, nothing felt missing. Then memory arrived, not sharply, but like a distant shape coming into focus. Watson remained still, allowing the realization to settle without resistance. The room was unchanged. Holmes's coat still rested where it had been placed. The chair by the window stood quietly, unoccupied, but not empty. Silence held. Watson rose and crossed to the window. The village below continued its measured rhythm. Smoke rose thinly from chimneys. A figure crossed the square, unhurried. Life moved forward without recognition of loss or resolution. There is no rupture here, Watson thought, only continuation. He dressed slowly and descended to the inn's dining room. Breakfast was laid out, as it had been before. The innkeeper greeted him with the same quiet nod. No questions were asked. No explanations offered. Watson ate without haste, grounding himself in the ordinary, the warmth of tea, the texture of bread, the soft murmur of the room. These small certainties steadied him. When he stepped outside, the air felt cool and clean. The path leading upward remained visible beyond the village, winding gently toward the mountains. It did not draw him forward. Today, his movement would be downward. Watson began the walk back toward the station alone. The path accepted him easily. Each step felt natural, neither heavy nor forced. The valley opened around him, its familiar contours unchanged. Birds moved quietly through the trees. Water continued its steady course over stone. As Watson walked, he noticed how the landscape offered no reflection of his inner state. It did not mirror grief or absence. It simply existed, and in that there was comfort. He paused briefly at the bridge over the stream, resting his hands on the worn wood. The water flowed beneath him, clear and purposeful, untroubled by awareness. Movement does not wait, Watson thought. It continues. He resumed his walk. Memories surfaced occasionally, not as intrusions, but as gentle acknowledgments. Holmes seated by the fire. Holmes at the window. Holmes walking ahead on a narrow path. Each image appeared briefly, then receded, leaving no disturbance behind. These were not reminders of absence. They were confirmations of what had been. The station came into view gradually. It looked as it had upon their arrival, quiet, orderly, unremarkable. A train waited, steam rising softly, ready to continue its own course. Watson purchased his ticket without comment. The clerk offered polite efficiency. Nothing more was required. As he boarded, Watson glanced once more toward the mountains. Their peaks rose calmly in the distance, unchanged, unconcerned. There is no need to look back, he thought. The path has already concluded. The train departed smoothly. The village slipped from view, settling once more into its place within the valley. Fields and slopes followed, unhurried, continuous. Watson took his seat by the window. As the train moved on, the rhythm returned, the familiar sound of wheels on track, the gentle sway that eased thought into stillness. Distance began to soften the mountains, their outlines blending gradually into the wider landscape. Watson felt no urgency to fill the time, no impulse to write, to plan, to anticipate. He allowed the motion to carry him forward. There will be time, he thought, not for explanation, but for remembrance. The countryside passed by in quiet sequence. Rivers curved and receded. Villages appeared and faded. Life continued without spectacle. As the day progressed, Watson felt the first subtle shift within himself, not pain, not grief, but recognition of solitude. It did not press inward. It simply existed, and he accepted it. Evening approached. Light softened. Lamps within the carriage glowed faintly. Passengers grew quieter, their own journeys folding inward. Watson rested back, allowing his eyes to close briefly. Alone did not mean unheld. The movement of the train, the steadiness of the world beyond the window, the certainty that paths continued even when shared travel ended, all of it formed a quiet framework around him. For now there was motion. For now there was direction. For now there was continuity. And as the train carried Watson onward, away from the valley and its still mountains, the world remained balanced, unchanged by loss, steady in its forward movement, holding space for remembrance, without demanding resolution. He held the letter for a long moment after finishing, allowing the finality of the signature to settle without disturbance. Outside, the train continued. The world did not pause. Fields stretched outward in calm succession. Roads curved gently, then disappeared. The rhythm of travel smoothed the edges of thought, allowing awareness to drift without resistance. Watson sat by the window, hands resting loosely in his lap. There was no urgency to arrive. As the day unfolded, light shifted across the land with quiet certainty. Morning gave way to afternoon without declaration. The world beyond the glass remained consistent in its motion, untroubled by individual journeys. It was only when the train slowed briefly at a small station, an unremarkable place, quiet and orderly, that Watson felt the subtle change within himself. Not disruption, not sorrow. A recognition arriving calmly, like a long-anticipated note finally sounding. He reached into his coat pocket. The envelope was there. He had known it would be. The paper was smooth, carefully folded, its presence neither surprising nor heavy. It had not been discovered suddenly, nor placed there by accident. It belonged to the moment when it would be read, and not before. Watson rested the envelope on the small table beside the window, but did not open it immediately. Outside, the train resumed its motion. The station slipped away. Feels returned. The rhythm continued. He allowed himself to breathe, deeply and evenly, grounding himself in the steady movement. The letter did not demand attention. It waited. Holmes had always respected timing. When Watson finally took the envelope into his hands, his grip was gentle, deliberate. He turned it once, then again, noticing the familiar handwriting, precise, restrained, unmistakable. There was comfort in its familiarity. He opened it slowly. The paper inside unfolded, without sound. Watson read, not quickly, not with anticipation. He allowed each line to arrive and settle before moving to the next, as though the words themselves carried a rhythm meant to be followed. My dear Watson, if you are reading this, then events have aligned precisely as intended. Watson paused briefly, letting the words settle. The train continued its steady course. There is no need for concern, nor is there cause for urgency. What has occurred has done so with clarity, balance, and purpose. Watson felt no tightening in his chest. The words did not wound. They steadied. I have often spoken of structures, systems that reveal their meaning only when viewed as a whole. This was one such structure. It required neither haste nor avoidance, only recognition. The countryside beyond the window seemed to soften further, as though responding to the calm precision of the lines. You may feel, in time, the impulse to search for explanation. I ask only that you resist it. Explanation belongs to unresolved matters. This is not one of them. Watson exhaled slowly. There are conclusions that do not signal loss, but completion. This is such a conclusion. The train crossed a bridge. Water passed beneath, smooth and untroubled. You have walked beside me through many corridors of thought and circumstance. You did so not as an observer, but as a stabilizing presence. For that, I am, without sentiment, grateful. Watson felt the weight of those words, steady and grounded, without emotional surge. I leave no instructions, because none are necessary. You have always understood when action was required, and when stillness served better. The letter did not instruct, it acknowledged. What remains for you is not absence, but continuity. The world will not narrow for you as it did for me. It will widen. Outside, the fields gave way briefly to a small town. Buildings passed in quiet sequence, then receded. Do not look for traces. They are neither hidden nor erased. They are simply no longer relevant. Watson nodded faintly, as though Holmes could see the gesture. Memory, when left undisturbed, becomes structure rather than burden. Allow it that transformation. The light shifted again, softening toward evening. I have never believed that proximity defines significance. Distance has always been more revealing. Watson folded the page slightly, then flattened it again, careful not to crease it unnecessarily. You will continue. That is not instruction. It is certainty. The words settled deeply, without force. There is no farewell here. Farewells imply separation. This is alignment. Watson reached the end of the page. Yours, S.H. He held the letter for a long moment after finishing, allowing the finality of the signature to settle without disturbance. Outside, the train continued. The world did not pause. Fields stretched outward in calm succession. Roads curved gently, then disappeared. The rhythm of travel smoothed the edges of thought, allowing awareness to drift without resistance. Watson sat by the window, hands resting loosely in his lap. There was no urgency to arrive. As the day unfolded, light shifted across the land with quiet certainty. Morning gave way to afternoon without declaration. The world beyond the glass remained consistent in its motion, untroubled by individual journeys. It was only when the train slowed briefly at a small station, an unremarkable place, quiet and orderly, that Watson felt the subtle change within himself. Not disruption, not sorrow. A recognition arriving calmly, like a long-anticipated note finally sounding. He reached into his coat pocket. The envelope was there. He had known it would be. The paper was smooth, carefully folded, its presence neither surprising nor heavy. It had not been discovered suddenly, nor placed there by accident. It belonged to the moment when it would be read, and not before. Watson rested the envelope on the small table beside the window, but did not open it immediately. Outside, the train resumed its motion. The station slipped away. Feels returned. The rhythm continued. He allowed himself to breathe, deeply and evenly, grounding himself in the steady movement. The letter did not demand attention. It waited. Holmes had always respected timing. When Watson finally took the envelope into his hands, his grip was gentle, deliberate. He turned it once, then again, noticing the familiar handwriting, precise, restrained, unmistakable. There was comfort in its familiarity. He opened it slowly. The paper inside unfolded, without sound. Watson read, not quickly, Not with anticipation, he allowed each line to arrive and settle before moving to the next, as though the words themselves carried a rhythm meant to be followed. My dear Watson, if you are reading this, then events have aligned precisely as intended. Watson paused briefly, letting the words settle. The train continued its steady course. There is no need for concern, nor is there cause for urgency. What has occurred has done so with clarity, balance, and purpose. Watson felt no tightening in his chest. The words did not wound. They steadied. I have often spoken of structures, systems that reveal their meaning only when viewed as a whole. This was one such structure. It required neither haste nor avoidance, only recognition. The countryside beyond the window seemed to soften further, as though responding to the calm precision of the lines. You may feel, in time, the impulse to search for explanation. I ask only that you resist it. Explanation belongs to unresolved matters. This is not one of them. Watson exhaled slowly. There are conclusions that do not signal loss, but completion. This is such a conclusion. The train crossed a bridge. Water passed beneath, smooth and untroubled. You have walked beside me through many corridors of thought and circumstance. The city received Watson without comment. There was no sense of return marked by recognition or relief. Streets unfolded as they always had, stone beneath foot, lamplight soft against evening air, distant movement blending into a continuous hum. London did not pause to acknowledge absence or arrival. It simply continued. Watson walked slowly, allowing the familiar weight of the city to settle around him. Buildings rose in patient lines. Windows glowed intermittently. Footsteps passed and faded. Everything remained exactly where it belonged. Time, here, moved differently, and for I refer did a rhythm it had in the mountains, not faster, just layered. Days followed one another, without ceremony. Mornings arrived with pale light filtering through curtains. Afternoons carried muted motion, carriages, voices, the rhythm of routine. Evenings softened the edges again, folding the city inward. Watson resumed his life gently. There was no deliberate effort to change or preserve anything. He moved through familiar spaces with calm intention, neither avoiding memory nor seeking it. Baker Street existed, as it always had, brick and steps and doors opening into quiet interiors. The sitting room at 221B remained unchanged. The chairs stood where they had always stood. The fireplace rested in quiet readiness. The shelves held their books with patient indifference. Nothing felt abandoned. 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 He sat by the fire some evenings, letting it settle into embers without stoking it higher. Sound reminded him of continuity, how warmth could exist without intensity, how presence did not require insistence. Holmes's violin remained untouched, not out of reverence, out of understanding. Some instruments belong to particular rhythms. This one had completed its purpose. Watson continued his work. Patients arrived. Conversations unfolded. Decisions were made. Life, in all its quiet complexity, pressed forward without awareness of private alignments and conclusions. Time absorbed everything evenly. Occasionally, Watson would notice small shifts, subtle changes in how he listened. how he waited before speaking, how silence felt less empty and more complete. These changes did not announce themselves. They revealed themselves gradually, as habits often do. Holmes had not vanished from Watson's thoughts. He had integrated. Memory arrived now not as recollection, but as structure. Holmes's clarity shaped Watson's own perceptions, how he assessed a situation, how he recognized when a question no longer required an answer. There was peace in that. Weeks passed. The city changed almost imperceptibly. Fog returned and retreated. Rain fell softly, then cleared. Seasons edged forward without declaration. Watson walked often through parks where leaves gathered quietly beneath trees, along streets where lamplight reflected in shallow puddles, across bridges where the river moved steadily beneath, indifferent to the lives unfolding above it. Movement steadied him. There were evenings when Watson would pause, noticing the absence of anticipation. He did not expect Holmes to speak from the shadows or appear suddenly at the window. That chapter had concluded with precision. Expectation had no place here, and yet there was no emptiness. What Holmes had been to Watson was not contained within proximity. It had always been contained within alignment. That alignment remained. One evening, Watson sat by the window as fog drifted once more along Baker Street. The street lamps glowed softly, their light diffused into halos. The scene mirrored countless nights before. He felt no ache, only familiarity. The world, Watson thought, does not narrow after completion. It widens. The thought settled easily. The letter remained tucked away, rarely touched. It did not require revisiting. Its purpose had been fulfilled the moment it had been read. There were no anniversaries marked, no rituals established. Life did not ask for them. Time continued to move forward, smoothing edges, integrating moments, reshaping absence into quiet presence. Watson slept well. Dreams, when they came, were unstructured, sounds, light, motion, without narrative. Sleep arrived without resistance and left without trace. The city outside continued its rhythm, unbothered by introspection. Occasionally, Watson would encounter moments of stillness, standing at a crossing before traffic resumed, waiting in a quiet room before a meeting began, pausing mid-step to watch rain fall evenly across stone. In those moments, he felt the same calm certainty he had felt in the mountains, not because of where he was, but because of how he now moved through the world. Time did not erase, it aligned. Holmes's absence did not leave a void. It left structure, an internal steadiness that guided thought. As months passed, Watson noticed that others responded to him differently. Conversations slowed. Words carried more weight. Silence felt less awkward, more intentional. He had changed. Not dramatically, not visibly, but precisely. And precision, once internalized, does not fade. The city entered another season. Light shifted again. Shadows lengthened, then shortened. The cycle continued, uninterrupted. Watson remained present. He did not look back often. When he did, it was not with longing, but acknowledgement. The path behind him had completed itself. The path ahead remained open. For now, there was movement without urgency. For now, there was memory without burden. For now, there was balance restored. And time, patient and indifferent, carried everything forward, absorbing what had been, shaping what would be, allowing the world to continue in its quiet, steady unfolding, exactly as it always had. The city carried its stories quietly. They did not announce themselves. They did not demand belief. They settled instead into corners of conversation, into pauses between sentences, into the spaces where certainty softened into reflection. London had always been a place where truths layered themselves gently over time, becoming less about proof and more about presence. Watson noticed this change gradually. It began with a comment overheard in passing, two voices lowered near a doorway, a name spoken not with excitement, but with respect. It continued with a question posed indirectly, framed as curiosity rather than inquiry, and then, occasionally, it arrived as silence, when someone hesitated before dismissing the improbable. Sherlock Holmes had become something else, not memory, not a rumor, a structure. Watson did not encourage it. He did not correct it. He allowed it to form as legends always do, through repetition, restraint, and the natural human tendency to preserve what resists explanation. There were stories of remarkable deductions made years earlier, now retold with softened edges. Stories of a figure glimpsed briefly in fog, or of problem resolved without visible cause. Each retelling altered slightly, losing detail while gaining resonance. Holmes's name remained. It rested in conversation with an ease that suggested permanence. Watson continued his days with steady purpose. His work filled the hours without consuming them. His evenings remained unhurried. He listened more than he spoke, observed more than he concluded. When asked, occasionally, carefully, about Holmes, Watson responded simply. He was precise, he would say. Nothing more was required. Precision invited no embellishment. The sitting room at 221B remained unchanged. It did not function as a shrine or a museum. It functioned as a room, used, respected, lived in. Chairs were sat in. Fires were lit. Windows were opened to admit air and light. The brass numbers on the door caught the light in the evening, glowing briefly before settling back into shadow. People passed beneath them daily, unaware of significance. That, Watson understood, was how legends endured. They did not isolate themselves. They integrated. Occasionally, Watson would receive a letter, someone asking, indirectly, whether Holmes might be consulted or whether his methods could be applied again. Watson replied courteously, without denial or affirmation. Circumstances change, he would write. Understanding endures. The responses were accepted without protest. Holmes had never been accessible in the usual sense. Even in life, he had existed slightly apart from expectation. That separation had not increased. It had clarified. The city Bouvert, the Sayad d'Escaper, the city became, to some, a place of quiet significance, not crowded, not advertised, simply noted. People slowed slightly as they passed. Some glanced upward at the windows, others did not. Both responses felt appropriate. Watson observed all of this without attachment. He understood now that legends were not built by those they concerned. They were shaped by those who needed them. Holmes's presence, now diffused, unlocatable, served a purpose beyond individual action. It represented the possibility of clarity in a complex world, the idea that some minds could resolve what others could not, and that idea did not require a body. Watson walked often in the evenings, moving through streets, softened by lamplight and fog. He listened to the city breathe. He noticed how conversations rose and fell, how urgency faded as night settled. London remained itself, vast, layered, indifferent. Within that indifference, Holmes's legend rested comfortably. There was no pressure for it to growl louder, no need for validation. It existed in proportion. One night, Watson paused outside 221B, standing briefly beneath the lamp. Fog drifted past, reshaping the street into abstraction. The building loomed quietly above him, unchanged. He felt no surge of emotion, only acknowledgement. Some places, he thought, do not require explanation. He entered, closed the door gently behind him, and allowed the warmth of the interior to receive him. Inside, the room held its familiar shape. Firelight flickered softly. Shadows moved along the walls without urgency. Watson sat and rested. The world beyond continued. Cases unfolded and resolved, some cleanly, some not. Life did not conform to neat conclusions, and yet the idea of Holmes lingered as reassurance, not that every problem would be solved, but that some could be approached with clarity rather than fear. That was the legend, not invincibility, not triumph. Precision. Watson did not feel responsible for preserving it. He did not feel obligated to speak of it. He trusted the city to carry what it needed. Time continued its work. Years softened edges further. Details faded. What remained was shape, an outline clear enough to recognize, vague enough to endure. Holmes became less a man and more a principle, and principles, once established, do not vanish. Watson aged gently. His pace slowed slightly. His attention deepened. He remained present, grounded in the quiet certainty that his life had intersected with something complete. He did not measure that completeness by duration. He measured it by alignment. One evening, as the city settled once more into fog and lamplight, Watson stood by the window and watched Baker Street breathe quietly below. There is no ending here, he thought, only continuation in another form. The legend remained, not as a story demanding retelling, but as a presence woven subtly into the fabric of the city, unannounced, unchallenged, unforgotten. And, as night carried London gently forward, the idea of Sherlock Holmes rested easily within it, no longer bound to footsteps or voice, but enduring precisely as it always had, through clarity, restraint, and the quiet certainty that some truths do not require proof to remain real. Night returned to Baker Street as it always had, without announcement, without insistence. It arrived not as darkness, but as a soft rearrangement of light. Windows dimmed. Street lamps took their place. The city folded gently inward, as though resting within its own familiar weight. Watson stood by the window, watching the evening settle. The street below breathed quietly. Footsteps passed and faded. A carriage rolled by at an unhurried pace, its sound softened by distance and stone. Fog drifted in pale ribbons, reshaping the world into suggestion rather than certainty. It was enough. Time had moved forward, as it always does, but it had not erased what mattered. It had absorbed it, distributing meaning evenly, smoothing sharp edges into something durable and calm. Watson turned from the window and crossed the room. The sitting room, 2021B, held its familiar stillness. The chairs rested where they always had. The shelves stood in patient order. The fireplace glowed softly. Its embers settled into a steady warmth that required no attention. Nothing in the room demanded action. That, Watson realized, was its greatest comfort. He sat and allowed the quiet to gather rather than fill. Silence here was not emptiness. It was structure, an arrangement of space where thought could rest without being directed. There were no cases to consider tonight, no letters awaiting reply, no urgency pressing inward, only the steady presence of night returning to its place. Watson listened. The city spoke in low tones, distant voices, the soft echo of movement, the subtle rhythm of life continuing beyond the window. These sounds did not intrude, they reassured. London had always been vast enough to hold many truths at once. Holmes's truth now existed within that vastness, unbound by time or proximity. It did not announce itself. It did not require recognition. It remained. Watson felt no need to name it. He rose briefly to adjust the fire, not to increase its warmth, but to maintain balance. The flames responded quietly, then settled again. Balance, he had learned, was not achieved through effort. It was maintained through attention. He returned to his chair and rested. The fog outside thickened slightly, then thinned again, moving with the same patient rhythm it had always known. Street lamps cast halos that softened into one another, dissolving edges, inviting the mind to loosen its hold on detail. Watson felt sleep approach, not suddenly, not insistently, but as a gentle inclination, like a tide drawing inward. Before yielding to it, he allowed his thoughts one last unstructured movement. Not memory, not reflection, acknowledgement. There had been journeys, there had been stillness, there had been completion, and now there was continuation. He did not feel alone, not because someone was present, but because presence itself had expanded beyond the need for companionship. What had once existed between two minds now existed within one, integrated, steady, sufficient. Watson closed his eyes. The room did not change. The city did not pause. The world continued exactly as it should. Sleep arrived gently. Dreams, if they came, did so without form, only sensation, warmth, motion, without direction. They asked nothing. They resolved nothing. Outside, night deepened. Baker Street rested beneath fog and lamplight, held within the steady rhythm of a city that had seen countless endings and countless continuations, and understood the difference between the two. Somewhere, far beyond sound nor sight, water continued to fall, stone continued to endure, time continued to move. And here, in this quiet room, nothing needed to be solved. For now, there was rest. For now, there was balance. For now, there was night. And as night returned fully to Baker Street, soft, familiar, complete, it carried with it no sense of loss, no echo of urgency, only the quiet assurance that some stories do not end. They settle. They remain. And in their remaining, they allow the world to sleep.